the first day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the second day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me two-factor auth and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the third day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the fourth day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 5th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 5 key vault keys, secrets and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 6th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 6 Azure functions, 5 key vault keys, secrets and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 7th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 key vault secrets, keys and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 8th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 8 APIM endpoints, 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 key vault secrets, keys and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 9th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 9 cache results, 8 APIM endpoints, 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 vault secrets, keys and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 10th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 10 send alerts of firing, 9 cache results, 8 APIM endpoints, 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 key vault keys, secrets and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 11th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 11 event subscriptions, 10 sends alerts of firing, 9 cache results, 8 APIM endpoints, 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 vault secrets, keys and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB. On the 12th day of AZ-204, my Azure gave to me 12 container apps, 11 event subscriptions, 10 send alerts of firing, 9 cache results, 8 APIM endpoints, 7 queues of queuing, 6 Azure functions, 5 key vault keys, secrets and certificates, 4 storage options, 3 app services, two-factor auth, and a free instance of Cosmos DB.
Hello everyone and welcome to my submission for the Festive Tech Calendar 2023. Of course, my name is Brian and I'm here to talk to you today about the 12 days of AZ-204. Now, hopefully you enjoyed the song that was preceding all of this, and if you're interested in connecting with me after this, you can find me at Gorman on the x.com or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and or LinkedIn at Brian L. Gorman. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we are talking about the AZ-204 exam. So real quick, of course, the AZ-204 exam is a massive exam with 12 different modules, hence the 12 days of AZ-204. So we can't go through everything today. So what I'd like to do is give you a 50,000 foot plane ride over top of the material so that you could use this as a quick review, double check yourself before you sit for the exam. Or maybe you're sitting and you're like, I don't know where to start. Maybe this will give you some help with that as well. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different things regarding the AZ-204 exam, developer technologies in Azure, and I will hopefully give you enough information to entice you to keep going forward or feel confident to take the exam by the time we're done. Now, before we get going into that real quick, if you haven't heard of this, there's a thing called the Microsoft Learning Rooms directory. Myself and a number of other professionals are making ourselves available to you free of charge through Microsoft on these rooms. So if you join the rooms, you can join us, and you can see a number of familiar faces out there, likely if you've been in the tech space for a long time. Here's me, of course. You can join my room, but there's a lot of other people. So if you don't like me, join somebody else's room. There's a lot of different trainers out there with different aspects of how they would train AZ-204 or other technologies. And you can see there's even a room out there for things like the Microsoft community of Pakistan and a bunch of other rooms. Some of these rooms are even actually Microsoft employees that are basically donating their time to this to help you learn. So come out here. These are free. Join as many rooms as you want. Join us on Teams. We talk about all things tech around the Microsoft technology stack, whether it's security, whether it's app dev, whether it's infrastructure, containerization, Power BI, whatever you need to learn, there's somebody out here who can help guide you in your journey. Also, I'd like to talk about practice tests. If you're sitting for this exam, you can purchase practice tests at Measure Up. There's also a free practice assessment that Microsoft offers, which you can get from the home page. So if you go out to the AZ-204 exam, there's actually a link right to this, and I'll throw the links in my stuff as well. There are also videos made by Microsoft. If you want to take some time to watch through these videos, talking about the different aspects as well, different things, high-level overview as well, so just keep that in mind. And it's the study guide for the AZ-204, where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. So I'll come back to that, but here's the AZ-204 Developing Solutions exam. So if I'm going to sit for the AZ-204 or any Microsoft exam, what I want to do is go to this exam page. So I typed in AZ-204 in Google, and it came right here. So obviously what you can see here is that it talks about the high-level stuff immediately. It gives you the link to those videos, the study guide, the prep. This is the study guide prep. This is the exam experience sandbox, which is a practice exam, kind of gets you familiar with what it's going to be like on game day. So you can sit for this and see what it's like and kind of get used to the format and figure out what you're going to do when you get there. So it talks about the skills measured. We're going to come back to that, but I just want to remind you that the 12 days of AZ-204 includes these 12 modules. So we have lots and lots of work out here. Obviously, we can't go into every little aspect today. We would spend more than enough time just going through the app service, for example. But you can see each one of those learning paths has different modules. Inside those modules, there are different tasks that you need to do. As you complete them, of course, you get trophies and awards and all the things, but what really matters is that this is actually preparing you for the exam. So these are academic, instructional information, things about the different possible topics that you might be tested on. These, of course, are not exam questions or how should I, do everything I could possibly do with Azure Functions, but these are, hey, I've never worked with Azure Functions. How do I get started? Great. I need to do something a little deeper with Azure Functions. Probably here as well, but maybe not as deep as you would get if you were doing it in the real world, right? These are academic, and they give you that prep to understand at least the moving pieces, the buttons you need to click, the commands you need to run, all the different things you would be potentially presented with on the exam. So I would make sure if I was going to sit for the AZ-204 that I had gone through this material, if at all possible. It is a lot of material, so maybe you want to use a strategy that I often like to refer to. I heard about it in a business coaching training thing that I had bought a few years ago, but ultimately it's called the 20-Mile March. And the 20-Mile March is a story of two teams that went to the South Pole, and each team had a different strategy. One team decided that they were going to take 20 miles no matter what the weather was. So every day they'd get up, they'd walk 20 miles or march 20 miles, and they'd make base camp each night. The second team said, rain or shine, we're not going to play that game. We're only going to go if the weather's nice, and we'll go as far as we can on the days the weather's nice. So what happened, of course, is the team that marched 20 miles every day made it to the South Pole. The other team, everybody died. The whole idea is 20-mile march. Well, how does that translate to what I'm telling you today? Give yourself an hour a night for say 90 days, maybe 5 days a week. So you're going to spend a little bit of time getting ready for this exam, but in 3 months from now, you could be sitting for this exam. If you just say, hey, I'm going to give up 1 hour of Netflix or a football game or my favorite show or whatever it is each week so that I can, each day, I'm not going to doom scroll all night long. Instead, I'm going to sit and watch some videos or read or do some actual practice exercises around different things within the AZ-204 space. So go through these, get yourself prepared, and sit for the exam. With all of that being said, obviously we can't go through all of these, and I sang a little song for you about the different things that are going to be covered, but let's spend the next 20 to 30 minutes or so just kind of figuring out what should I really focus on in each of these areas. So if I go through and I look at the study guide for the AZ-204, you can see that there are a number of things about the exam, but what really matters is this section here on the skills measured, and whatever the current date is it doesn't matter, it's just use the current version. So first of all, you should be proficient in Azure SDK. So the SDK right there, that tells me that I need to be proficient in writing code with the Azure SDK libraries for things like Cosmos DB, Azure Storage, Service Bus, Event Hub, different things that might require me to interact with client libraries. So data storage options. So that tells me I need to be able to be familiar with the different options to store things like when should I use Cosmos DB? When should I use Azure Tables? When should I use Azure Blob Storage? What other data storage options exist? MySQL, different things that I might use. PostgreSQL for Cosmos DB. So different things that you might need to be aware of around the data storage. You should be able to know when to choose the right thing and essentially how to work with them. Data connections, which may be things like the SDK library to connect directly to a service. It may be bindings on an Azure function. It may actually even be the app configuration value stored in the configuration or key vault for app services or app configuration. Different APIs. How can I work with Azure APIs? Can I make calls to the REST API directly? Do I need to do that? What's the purpose of having that availability? App authentication and authorization. The ability to essentially authenticate my users, let them in the front door, and then authorize them to do things within my app. How do I do that within the Microsoft ecosystem? How do I bring in third party? How do I use different login patterns such as on behalf of or third-party device authentication? So you have the difference between passing credentials from a call to your web API to another third-party web API or something where you have to still be federated and act as the user instead of the app. So you need to know how to do things like that. You need to understand how to do things like a device auth flow where basically I can authorize my TV to watch Netflix and it says, things like, hey, go to your computer and enter this code. You need to be understanding what those at least are so that you might be able to implement those as a developer. Compute and container deployment. So this one is a really interesting world right now. Obviously, the big shift has happened over the last few years as Microsoft moved to open source and everything kind of was able to be offered on Linux. Containerization was a natural evolution of that. Of course, we've got Kubernetes, so the Azure Kubernetes service might come into play a little bit, but mostly the Azure Container Apps probably living on top of that. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. Debugging. If you're any kind of developer at all, you should understand what you need to do to debug your apps. So I'm not even going to spend a lot of time there. Maybe a little bit about getting remote debugging going, but that, that's more of a developer thing. So you should be good there. All right. So let's take a minute to breathe for a second. That's a lot, and that's not even getting started. There's a lot there that maybe I said something you've never done, and maybe scary. Okay. It's a big world, and it's a big test. So let's talk about some strategies around prepping for this exam. So essentially, this right here should be your guidepost of how you're going to go about studying for the AZ-204. So right here you see that Azure Compute Solutions is at 25 to 30%, Azure Storage is at 15 to 20, Azure Security is 20 to 25, monitoring, troubleshooting, and optimizing is at 15 to 20, and connecting to and consuming Azure services and third parties also at 15 to 20. Now this is more evenly spread than typically in the past, but even still, there are at least one or two areas here that are going to dominate the test. The Azure Compute Solutions and Azure Security. So I would look at this and I'd say those are the two that show up probably the most frequently on the exam. because of their overall weightedness. So Azure Security might play into app service stuff or Key Vault or things like that. So keep that in mind. It's not just about RBAC or role-based access control. It may be a whole bunch of other things. But what I do is I look at this and I say, okay, I'm actually pretty good with Azure storage, right? Azure storage doesn't really scare me too much. And it's only maybe 15% of the exam. So I might actually put that off till the very last week or something. And I might spend a little more time here. Azure Compute Solutions. Maybe I'm not as strong at container apps because I've never actually used them in the real world. So I might spend some time reviewing the different things that they show us about container apps in the actual Learn modules. I might even implement a solution or two just to quickly see how some of the nuances might play out, where maybe the thing isn't as simple to deploy as it might be laid out to be, or maybe there are some gotchas that you run into when you're actually trying to connect apps to databases or things like that, just to kind of see how that would play out. I would also look at the security part again, saying, I probably need to figure out how to create managed identities and be able to authenticate an app service against Key Vault or an app configuration against Key Vault, be able to write code that would leverage Key Vault secrets or the app config shared secrets. I might even look into the app config feature flags. I'm not sure if that's going to show up on the exam, but as a developer, if I don't at least know enough to be dangerous in these areas, I'm not going to get very far anyway, so it's not going to hurt me to spend time studying those. So looking at the compute solutions, let's just start from the top here. Even though I might take a different approach to the study overall, let's just go top down and talk about these different techs. So implementing containerized solutions. So if you're like me and started in .NET, you likely didn't even use Docker until a few years ago. You had no reason to. Maybe you still don't. Unfortunately, that's not going to cut it for the exam anymore. So you now have a reason to use Docker, even if it's just to get prepped for the exam. So you should learn the Docker commands. You should be able to create images from your local command line. You should be able to run a container from your local command line. You should understand what it means to push and pull containers to container registries, deploying Azure container registries. You should be able to leverage a container registry in either an app service, or you might have the Azure Container Apps itself, which is actually just the idea of the orchestration of Kubernetes being abstracted from you and being done by Azure for you. So you might even want to spend a little time learning what it means to do things like an ingress controller into a Kubernetes cluster. And think about what we did in the past to where we are now, where in the past we might have had a workload of on-prem VMs that was basically load balanced. Kubernetes is nothing more than that. It's just a managed service for containers. It says we can have a pool of VMs that basically provide our compute, and we put our containers on them, and then the Azure Kubernetes service does the orchestration for us to keep those containers live and active, and all the health probes and liveness probes and different things that it needs to do. All of that stuff comes into play, but understanding that ecosystem is going to be a big part of a developer lifecycle going forward, and therefore is a big part of AZ-204 exam. So app service web apps. If you've done anything with Azure, this is probably the thing you're the most familiar with, and if not, this is probably the easiest entry-level thing to do. So create a .NET web app and deploy it into Azure App Service, and ultimately see how that works. But let's talk about the deeper inner workings that you probably want to be familiar with when you're ready for the exam. You should understand what it means to look at the metrics of the app service. You might want to even know what scaling options are available and how you could do some auto scaling around those app services depending on looking at the metrics. You should be able to understand what it means to publish to an Azure web app, whether that's Azure pulling from a repo or you publishing to a repo via the publish profile, or even better, if you understand a little bit more about actions or pipelines, maybe understanding what it means to create a service principal and then leveraging that to deploy some IAC to make an app service and potentially put the app in it, but know at least how to connect a CI/CD pipeline where you can deploy the code into an app service. So different things that you need to be able to configure. Understand the configuration settings of the Azure App Service where you can create connection strings and different third-party API keys, different connections to Key Vault for the security part of things, and how that plays out. The Azure Functions. You're going to have a lot of different things you could do with Azure Functions. I would be ready to talk about the difference between a consumption function app and an actual hosted function app. different things that you could do there, but ultimately, durable functions versus regular functions. So thinking back to how functions were originally created, they didn't have durability, they didn't have state. Now we have durable functions that live on top of the Azure function ecosystem. So I would look into durable functions if you've never used them, and I would understand the different patterns available with Azure durable functions, specifically things like fanning in and fanning out, the way you can chain functions to follow one after the other, or different patterns like human interaction for monitoring or escalating. Those are important things to be ready for when you're learning about durable functions and using them, but also maybe potentially on the exam. You would also want to look at the difference between what triggers are available, what it means to have input and output bindings on those functions versus using SDK code, and how that differs in implementation and what that means for you as the developer. All right, Azure Storage. So of course, part of Azure Storage is Cosmos DB, and so you would need to spend a little time with Cosmos DB if you haven't. Now, of course, as you know, there's a free Cosmos DB for your account, so go ahead and get that set up. Put yourself about 400 RUs on that thing in a manual so it doesn't scale, and you won't run any costs. And then you could figure out what it means to use partition keys, figure out what it means to look into distributing your load evenly across those internal containers for an Azure Cosmos DB. The other thing that might play out that would be really interesting to do, going back to the Azure functions, is looking at the Azure Cosmos change feed. So you can see how you could possibly use a denormalized approach, but keep your records basically up to date within the non-relational data of a Cosmos DB by using a change feed and responding to that with an Azure function. Consistency level is also another big deal for the Cosmos DB, which gives you the ability to understand how long it takes for a read to get the data that was written. So basically, if I write with a strong consistency, it has to replicate globally before anybody can read it, versus if I do an eventual consistency, you might get a dirty read because somebody might have wrote in another region and you might not see that for up to a minute or two, right? So ultimately, just kind of understand that the different five different levels of consistency and where you might put an app in the real world, depending on your needs. Blob storage is probably the easiest thing you can do in Azure. So if you've never done anything and you just want to get your feet wet, this is an easy starting place. From creating a blob storage account with IAC, all the way through leveraging containers and understanding how to show data from a container in an app, like on a page as an image, or potentially leveraging documents or uploading documents from your app service. This is probably the most straightforward, easiest thing you can work with. So it might be a good starting place if you're brand new to Azure. Ultimately, looking at the SDK specifically, setting and retrieving properties via the SDK using code, specifically around metadata, so you could use that to do things like cognitive services to search for specific blobs because you've put metadata keys in place. Very important in a big data scenario or a document search scenario. Performing operations on data by using the appropriate SDK. So which SDK am I using? Am I using table storage? Am I using blob storage? Am I using file storage? Am I using queue storage? Understanding what queue storage means might come into play a little more when you try to make a queuing decision versus a service bus. And so we can talk about that in messaging. Static site hosting is a new thing too. So this is really cool because if you've done anything with Angular or React or any of the JavaScript flavors of choice, ultimately you likely have a front-end web app that has a UI built with static JavaScript that you can use. So you can host your backend in an Azure App Service, does all the stuff you need to do against the database, and exposes the API calls for your static Angular or React web app. You can host the Angular or React web app in the static Azure site that you can create through Azure Storage. And it's very straightforward to get a deployment to work to basically get your stuff out there, both to the backend and the front end, using those two services in tandem. Azure security, big deal, because this is kind of where everybody needs to spend at least some of their time, no matter what part of the stack you're in, whether you're in infrastructure, hardware, whether you're in the application development itself, or if you're just in the support of an application. You need to understand what it means to give users rights and how to make sure that they don't have too much or that they don't have too little. And so finding that fine balance and knowing how to use that, but also authorizing apps to work against each other in the Azure ecosystem. Are they going to be available publicly, or are they only going to be available on a private network? And if so, what does that mean for my authorization and authentication? Am I going to use a federated credential as my auth ID? Basically, am I going to use a third party like Google or Facebook or something to log users in? Or am I going to use Microsoft for sign-in? Am I going to use a built-in ASP identity in my ASP.NET app service and not allow any of that? Those are choices you have to make at the architecture level, but you need to understand what it means for your implementation in code if you do all of that. How do I implement a third-party login using Microsoft or Google or Facebook? Or how do I use that to authenticate your apps so that they can't even get there if they're not authenticated, but then authorize them within the app to do specific role-based things that I want them to do on the app itself? So going back a little bit to storage, we had the blob storage. And if we lock all the blob storage down, which is the new default, by the way, everything won't be available publicly. The only way to get to it is either through the SDK with the storage connection string, or you can do a thing called a shared access signature. Now, the SAS, or the shared access signature, gives you a token that says, with this URL to the blob storage, I can get there. In addition to the URL, I need to add this token, and it gives me specific permissions either against a specific blob or the entire container. And that's what a SAS token could do. Understand what it means to issue them, how it could possibly be revoked if it's possible at all, and what that means for your app security around making sure that people can only get to data that they should see. For example, legal documents that they need to download, making sure that specific users can only see the documents that they're authorized to see. Microsoft Graph, of course, is how Microsoft does all of its authentication internally. So being able to request credentials and say, I would like you to log in with your Microsoft user. I need to ask for the user.read scope in order to get your permissions to say that. What does that mean? How do I set it so that I can have an admin give authorization for the entire organization versus having me have to have every single user log in and give permission? So of course, one of the big deals is going to be the securing your Azure solutions using Key Vault or app configuration, or possibly the two in tandem. And so you're going to want to understand what it means to leverage a Key Vault secret from code, how you can authorize a user or an app service or both to get that secret, list that secret, potentially even update or create secrets, and what that means for their specific credentials being able to do things. For example, if I can list secrets, I have access to all the secrets in the vault. So maybe you don't want list, maybe you just want get, which says, at least if I know the secret, I can get it. But I can't list your secrets to iterate them. However, in code, you likely need both, right? You need to be able to list the secrets in order to get them and then use them. So keep that in mind. So you'll need to be able to write code, but I would also be prepared to do this with a command line, to issue an Azure CLI command that could create a secret or update a secret, just in case that something like that might show up for you. Now, another thing is, of course, the managed identities. So this is a big deal. Understand the difference between a system-managed identity and a user-managed identity, and what that means for authorization and the life cycle of that identity and when you should use each one. A user-managed identity is something that I would use if I have a fleet of services or VMs that need to have the same permissions. It lives outside of the life of those resources, so it lives even if they're all deleted, and it has permissions set once that all of them then can leverage. So perhaps a fleet of VMs need to be able to read a secret from Key Vault. They all use the same user-managed identity, which has the authorization to read from Key Vault. However, an app service maybe is a one-off. So the lifecycle of that managed identity needs to live with the app service or function app or APIM or whatever it might be. That service or that thing can have a one-to-one relationship with the identity. So you'd use a system-managed identity. If I delete the resource, it's also gone. Monitor, troubleshoot, and optimize Azure solutions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. The main thing you need to get out of this is implementing Azure Redis cache, understanding a few things about caching like cache aside, being able to use those cache patterns in your code. And then finally, understanding what it means to be a CDN, how you might implement a CDN at Azure so that you can have point of presence, and essentially the life cycle of an object as it's requested from the world to Azure, and how that plays out with different point of presence nodes as I make requests first and second and third times, etc. Application insights is going to be a big deal for us in the real world. Maybe not as big a deal on the exam. Maybe it plays out in a couple of the other areas, but we need to understand a little bit about Kusto so that we can write some queries to get some data. We need to understand how to leverage those logs to figure out where exceptions are being thrown, how to write application insights telemetry from our apps, implement Azure Application Insights on your code as well. You're going to want to be able to know what it means to get the application insights telemetry injected into controllers, or be able to leverage the actual telemetry object with your connection string to be able to write or basically track exceptions, tracking traces, so that you can say, every time somebody visits the page, I write an event to the application insights, or every time we throw this exception, I log that exception applicant insights so I can review that later. Connecting to and consuming Azure services and third-party services. So creating an APIM. This is going to be probably the most important part of the whole thing. With the APIM, then you could play around with implementing your own Azure functions, or leveraging a third-party API that's public. Understand what it means to put policies on it, to throttle the inbound requests. Understand the different pieces of APIM, like products and subscriptions. Be able to talk logically about when you would use those to create different products for customers to use and consume your APIs. The creation and documentation of APIs, the fact that if you go with the developer version, or better, you get the developer website, which then lets you have a content management system around your API that you could put out there, similar to Swagger, if you're familiar with Swagger, but it's a Microsoft thing, and it just goes along with your APIM. And you can expose what APIs that you want to expose and talk about what those do, so that your developers who are using your API could come to that page and read about it. Finally, anytime you're going to work with the AZ-204, basically Azure ecosystem, you're going to need to understand how to do eventing and messaging. You're going to want to know the difference between things like Event Grid and Event Hub, where the Event Grid is a one-off, fire and forget type of event. Somebody might respond to it, somebody might not. I don't care. I just need to tell somebody that this happened. You shut down a VM, an event fires. You drop a file in blob storage, an event fires. You do something else on the Azure ecosystem, an event fires, right? All of that stuff is monitored and tracked, but unless you subscribe to it, it just goes off into the ether. So you create an Event Grid subscription, which then responds. So I drop a file in blob storage. The subscription then says, oh, I'm responding to that. I'm going to trigger an Azure function, or a logic app, or some other action that I want to do. Maybe I'm sending that information to a third-party API, whatever it might be, via a webhook, right? So you have those options available to you. So that's the Event Grid system. Then you have the Event Hub. Well, what's the Event Hub? The Event Hub is a big data ingestion system, which allows me to stream millions of records per second into my ecosystem. So I might use this for IoT telemetry as an IoT hub, or I might use the Event Hub full for things like responding to messages being sent to me to process big data. So maybe I have a point of sale system that is distributed across thousands of registers, across thousands of stores across the world or the United States or whatever, and every single one of those is constantly reporting back sales data. And that sales data needs to be ingested and then processed. The Event Hub is a perfect solution for that. It can take the message from the point of sale endpoint, and it can respond to that by ingesting it. You can then put that data into storage as capture automatically, or you can push the data into something like a Stream Analytics, which then evaluates to see if there's anything out of the norm and pushes to a hot path, which maybe is displayed on a Power BI dashboard, where you can then see, hey, we're not making any sales in London, or, hey, maybe the sales in San Francisco are way high. Maybe we were priced too low for that area or something. So you can respond to that event data in real time. You can also put it to a warm path that maybe goes to an Azure function or a logic app, which does some more telemetry processing and analysis, or it goes just to cold storage, which you can come back and then play postmortem. So the Event Hub is for ingestion of millions of records per minute to your system. The Event Grid is a one-off fire and forget. Service Bus and Azure Storage Queue are your queuing solutions. What's the difference between, and which one should I use when? So if I'm going to use Azure Storage Queues, I know that I'm likely not going to care about order as much because I can't guarantee order in the Azure Storage Queues. But I also likely am going to use this if my messages are small and I'm going to have lots of them. So maybe I need to store more than 80 gigabytes of messages at a time. The Azure Queue Storage is the solution for that. The service bus is the more robust solution of the two, so you're going to get a little bit of a cost benefit if you go with queue storage, but again, you can't guarantee the order, and you can't have a very big message. So I think they're limited to like 256 kilobytes in size or something. They're very small message sizes. Whereas the service bus, you can get a little bit bigger messages. You can guarantee order, and you can do some more robust operations. So one of the big things about service bus is you can also do, not only can you do a straight queue, which is basically, your first in, first out queue that you would expect to happen, but you can do a thing called a topic. And what a topic does is allows me to create subscriptions. So now I can split the same queue into multiple versions of it where the consumers only get the queue information they need. This is related to them. This is really great for scenarios like I have specific customers and I want to queue messages to some of those customers, but not all of them. Well, I can put them into the service bus topic, and then based on the subject or a filter that I decide, whatever that might be, in that message object that I send to it, whether it's the subject of the message or something about the body maybe is filtered, whatever it might be, the only people that read that specific message in their queue are the consumers that I want to see it, based on the filters I predefine. Now, the other thing about this is it's an individual copy of the queue. So if, customer 1 reads the queue completely, customer 2 still has all those messages available to them in the queue because essentially it's the same queue with their data. So they don't compete with each other for those messages. So at the end of the day, this whirlwind tour I hope was helpful. Again, I would personally spend time with container apps because it's probably my weakest area out of all of this. I would look back and I would see, which one of these is the weakest one I'm at, and I would start there. I'd go to the Learn resources. I would ask for help if you have questions in the learning rooms. Go take practice tests. Work through those Learn modules. If there's things in Learn modules that give you problems, ask in a learning room. Come to our learning rooms, please, and ask for help. There's all these people out here who would love to give you a chance to earn the exam or basically help be a part of your journey. So I'm going to do a couple shameless plugs then to kind of finish this out. So if you were looking for additional tools, I would like you to go to the Azure Cloud Workshops. Specifically, if you need some serverless. I've been working on this. Microsoft developed this originally, but they don't support it anymore. So I've been trying to keep it up. Obviously, if you see issues or want to contribute to make it better, I would love that help. But ultimately, this is a free thing out there at GitHub at the Azure Cloud Workshops. Serverless architecture gives you the chance to work through some serverless stuff. Going through this could be the one thing that gives you enough practical experience to dive deeper into service bus queues or Azure SQL or Cosmos or SendGrid or sending emails from a Logic app, whatever it might be. Working with the event grid, working with Azure Functions, seeing different ways to do input and output bindings versus actually using the SDK. Those things are all covered in here, and it's a great place for you to leverage that as well. Finally, if you're really interested, I do have a book on the AZ-204. If you're interested, go out there and review the review the book and see if you're interested in it. If you are and you order it, please let me know what you think. Please let me know if it could be improved or if there's problems so that I can make sure that stays up to date as well. So that's basically going to be the tour of the 12 days of AZ-204. Thank you very much for your time. Good luck with the exam. Let me know how you're doing. Join my learning room and let's interact, or connect with me on LinkedIn and we can message back and forth there. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for letting me be a part of your journey, and enjoy the rest of your Festive Tech Calendar journey as well. Thanks again to Gregor and Keith for making sure that this event continues to be awesome every year.